The world is drowned in wind and wire. December 1944. The edge of Germany. Dense evergreens rising like black walls against a sky split by artillery. Snow falls in thick, soundless sheets, muffling everything except the dull, rhythmic pounding of guns far off toward the front. The forest smells of smoke and antiseptic. Inside a collapsed farmhouse that now serves as an American field dressing station, light flickers from a single gasoline lantern. Tin basins tremble on wooden tables. A nurse, helmet pushed low, sleeves rolled above raw, frozen wrists, ties a strip of torn bed linen into a bandage. Her breath clouds, then vanishes. In the next room, a corpseman whispers a prayer over the moaning wounded. Outside, someone yells through the frost. More men are pinned beyond the ridge. They're too close to the German lines for a stretcher team. For a moment, the nurse stares at the door, listening to the whistle of incoming shells. She picks up a Red Cross flag and a flashlight, ignoring the protests behind her. The snow swallows her footsteps. To understand how she ended up here, in this frozen corridor between life and death, we must rewind to the world that built her courage. In the waning months of 1944, Europe was a continent of exhaustion. The Allies had broken through at Normandy, crossed France, and hammered their way toward the German border. Behind every surge of tanks and infantry trailed another kind of army, an army of healers, hauling blood, gauze, and hope into the line of fire. Among them were the women of the U.S. Army Nurse Corps. By winter, 57,000 of them served worldwide, on ships, in desert tents, aboard air ambulances, in the mud of Italy, and amid the shattered villages of Belgium. Their job was simple to describe and almost impossible to endure: keep young men alive long enough for evacuation. The front was fluid. No line was truly safe. When the Germans shelled an artillery position, the concussion wave tore through nearby hospitals just the same. Medical tents were marked with red crosses taller than a man, yet stray bombs shredded them without discrimination. Nurses whose hands once practiced gentle ward routines now worked amid engine grease and frozen soil, turning ration tins into surgical trays, ripping drapery for bandages, and improvising under fire. Official history sometimes calls them non-combatants, but the casualty records suggest otherwise. Over 200 Army nurses were killed during the war. Dozens were captured and imprisoned. Those who survived carried frostbite scars and shrapnel under their skin. They learned to pack wounds with the same precision they once folded linens, and to speak in tones that concealed terror. Their world revolved around triage. One glance at a soldier's eyes told them whether morphine or morphia prayers would be the more merciful choice. By the time winter closed over the Ardennes and the Hürtgen Forest, the American advance had slowed to a crawl. The Germans defended every ridge fiercely, fighting with the desperation of men who knew their homeland lay behind them. For the medics and nurses, this was a nightmare unlike Normandy or Anzio. The trees themselves became lethal, splintering into wooden shrapnel under high explosive bursts. Ambulances bogged down axle-deep in frozen mud. Many wounded never reached the evacuation points. Litter bearers collapsed from exposure before their charges could be saved. Still, hospitals had to function. The 45th Evacuation Hospital, one of many leapfrogging units designed to follow combat divisions, set up inside bombed-out German factories and cloisters, scavenging bricks to build operating platforms. Inside these temporary wards, the medical teams worked in 12-hour shifts that bled well into 20. Air raids rattled the windows while nurses passed surgical tools under bare bulbs powered by sputtering generators. Penicillin was still precious. Plasma supplies fluctuated. Infection, not bullets, remained the chief killer. Yet the tempo of medicine echoed the tempo of war: fast, mechanical, determined. When trucks groaned to the gates with new stretcher loads, the nurses already had morphine syringes between their teeth and fresh gloves ready. Behind these clinical details lay something quieter, an ethic of unwavering duty. Contemporary diaries show nurses writing of small victories, a boy opening his eyes, a fever breaking at dawn, but also of unbearable choices. There were days when the wounded arrived faster than hands could help them. The most grievously injured had to wait, while others were stabilized. Each decision felt like a personal court-martial. They seldom saw the headlines that chronicled the great offensives. Their own battle line was measured in inches of gauze and minutes of pulse. In ruins smelling of iodine and cordite, they learned the hard arithmetic of service. One life saved was miracle enough. The woman at the center of our story, a representative of many, rather than a single name, came from that sisterhood. She was trained not for glory, but for endurance, a professional among chaos. When she volunteered for overseas duty, the forms listed her skill in anesthesia and trauma rotation. They did not mention her stubbornness, her refusal to leave patients under any circumstance, or the letters she carried from home that she never answered. By the first snows of December 1944, her hospital unit moved to the outskirts of a hamlet near the Hürtgen Forest. The roads were mined. The horizon crackled with flares. German artillery positions were barely 4 miles away. Steam rose from the kitchen tent where coffee boiled next to field sterilizers. In that landscape of cedar and wire, she and her fellow nurses prepared for the flood of wounded they knew was coming. And come it did, throughout days and nights when dawn never seemed to arrive. At the moment when their own defenses began to crumble, and the walking wounded overflowed the wards, another challenge awaited her, one far beyond standard duty. When the order came to relocate the hospital closer to the front, it was both an honor and a sentence. The 45th Evacuation Hospital's convoy crept through roads flanked by churned mud and broken pines, headlights hooded in blackout paint. Engineers had cleared just enough of the forest for makeshift paths. To either side of the route, gutted panzer hulls smoldered under the falling snow. The nurses rode in the back of a troop carrier wedged between surgical crates and crates of bandages, humming to drown out their own fear. By late afternoon, the unit reached a skeletal industrial complex once used for logging machinery. It would serve as their new hospital. The floors were slick with oil. The windows had been blown out long ago. Within hours, they strung canvas between columns, draped blackout fabric, and marked the entrance with hastily painted red crosses on white canvas. From the outside, it looked nothing like sanctuary, more like a wound in the landscape, but it began to pulse with life. At dusk, the first trucks arrived, their loads stacked with bundled bodies and muffled groans. The nurses repeated the ritual they knew by muscle memory: cut away frozen uniforms, staunch arterial bleeds, inject morphine, label foreheads with triage tags. Litter bearers slipped on blood-slick floors. Surgeons worked bare-armed in the smoke and cold, hands cramped from holding clamps too long. For every man leaving the operating table alive, another arrived collapsing before even reaching the door. Most nurses in the unit had stopped trying to remember names, not out of coldness, but preservation. Instead, they would recall voices, gestures, and accent carried from Colorado or Kentucky. Diaries later describe one woman who kept a folded map pinned on the wall, not of Europe, but of the United States, where she drew a small star each time a soldier mentioned his hometown. By December's end, the map resembled a constellation of sacrifice. Daily life around the hospital threaded the narrow line between routine and disaster. Morning began with temperature readings, pulse counts, and a silent head count of staff still breathing. Coffee tasted of iodine, because every canteen doubled as sterilizing cup. Nights brought bombing raids that forced patients and staff to crouch under cots while ceiling plaster crumbled. Sleep ran in 20-minute fragments. Letters from home sat unopened in breast pockets. Yet amid exhaustion, small mercies endured. Christmas packages arrived via the Red Cross, each with chocolate and a note from strangers. A makeshift choir of nurses and orderlies whispered carols between shell bursts. When a soldier regained consciousness, someone always found a slice of canned peach for him. Humanity persisted in shards, cutting through the darkness with quiet defiance. The nurse at the story's center operated as both caregiver and leader. When shipment delays starved the surgical ward of plasma, she organized shared tables, calculating drip timing so no soldier went longer than necessary without infusion. Her superiors trusted her judgment implicitly. Men bled in her care without panic, because her voice never wavered above the shellfire racket. To them, steadiness meant survival. Then came the storm that tested that steadiness beyond endurance. In mid-December 1944, the German counteroffensive through the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, erupted without warning. The American line buckled. Wounded poured in faster than transport could haul them back. The hospital now stood barely behind the shifting front. Telephone lines went dead, and retrieve signals crackled over the field radios. During one night of heavy shelling, fragments tore through the ambulance yard, scattering corpsmen and igniting fuel stores. Reports came that a half-dozen soldiers lay trapped in a drainage trench beyond the ridge, too close to German positions for artillery cover, too far for any organized rescue before dawn. No officer ordered anyone to go. None dared. Inside the hospital, she heard the screams carried by the wind. She checked the clock, then the bandage supplies, and made her choice. The impossible rescue was no plan, only instinct, a refusal to calculate the odds. Everything that would happen next was born from that moment. Courage in war often arrives disguised as ordinary habit. For this nurse, bravery was not a single act, but the repetition of care when logic said to stop. Before the night of the rescue, she had already crossed an invisible threshold between duty and self-destruction. Every man she tried to save reminded her of someone she'd already lost. Every sound of distant artillery echoed the patient who never woke. To understand her decision, one must picture the psychological terrain of the medical front line. There was no adrenaline of attack, no roar of victory, only the ceaseless replay of agony. She built defenses in silence, folded sleeves exactly, arranged instruments with geometric precision, drew strength from the rhythm of tasks. That quiet order was its own trench. When nurses later wrote their memoirs, many admitted that the hardest part wasn't fear of dying, but fear of not doing enough. The nurse in this story felt that same weight. She knew that the men calling for help beyond the ridge had minutes, not hours. She also knew her male counterparts were counted upon for combat, not her. In that inequality lay a strange freedom. Because no one expected her to act, she could act entirely on conscience. Years later, when witnesses were interviewed by the Red Cross, one medic recalled her expression that night, like she was walking into weather. It wasn't desperation or defiance, simply inevitability. Human instinct stripped of everything except the will to comfort. Battlefield medicine in the Hürtgen sector presented logistical torment. Terrain dictated every success and failure. Steep wooded slopes, shattered roads, and mud that swallowed vehicles whole. Evacuating wounded under those conditions was closer to engineering than mercy. Litter paths twisted through frozen stumps where artillery fire had transformed trees into jagged spears. Standard protocol forbade medical personnel from crossing into contested zones after nightfall. Armistice flags could be misread in the dark. The Luftwaffe still strafed medical convoys despite Geneva markings. Nevertheless, American medics occasionally negotiated temporary truces with their German counterparts to retrieve casualties, brief ceasefires that lasted mere minutes before the world erupted again. The so-called impossible rescue was launched against every rulebook. The trench beyond the ridge lay about 250 meters from the hospital perimeter, separated by open ground raked with overlapping machine gun fields. Floodlights and flares from both sides reduced darkness to a strobing nightmare. The nurse assessed the situation with a soldier's clarity. She borrowed a white bedsheet, tied it around a pole, and pinned a small Red Cross armband to her sleeve. 2 corpsmen volunteered to follow her as litter bearers. Their plan: crawl halfway, signal with a flashlight hooded in medical gauze, hope the enemy recognized the symbol, and survive long enough to drag the wounded back. Tactically, it was suicide. But the move also exploited a lingering fragment of military convention: respect for the emblem of mercy. Even hardened German units, under Field Marshal Model, occasionally hesitated when they saw medical insignia. That hesitation, measured in heartbeats, was the tactical gap she intended to widen. While weapons defined the broader war, technology quietly transformed medicine. By late 1944, penicillin shipments from Britain and the United States had become the single most valuable cargo on supply trains. Each vial recovered from down transports was treated like treasure. Plasma transfusions, introduced earlier in the conflict, revolutionized shock treatment, but demanded cold storage few field units possessed. Inside the 45th Evacuation Hospital, the nurse oversaw the plasma rotation schedule. She knew precisely how long each bottle could hang before congealing in the cold, memorized the calibration marks on the makeshift drip stands, and often rationed doses to stretch supplies another 12 hours. Improvisation became technical innovation. Empty ammunition boxes lined with ice served as blood coolers. Surgical clamps were fashioned from typewriter springs salvaged from the abandoned German factory. This practical inventiveness, born of scarcity, provided the backdrop for her decision to act. Every previous success, every infection halted by penicillin, every patient revived with plasma, reinforced her faith in what human capability could wrest from hopeless environments. Technology was her confidence armor. If medicine had conquered sepsis, could it not also shield her from bullets? Of course, it could not, but the illusion was enough. It was through this fragile union of skill and denial that she stepped into the blizzard, carrying not weapons, but the instruments of healing. And while machines of destruction thundered on both sides, her own mastery of simpler technology, light, cloth, compassion, was about to challenge them. War has a strange capacity for sudden decency. On the German lines opposite the Hürtgen clearing, Oberleutnant Karl Voigt commanded a machine gun emplacement that had shredded 2 previous rescue attempts. His men were veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened by years of attrition. They knew that silhouettes crawling in the snow usually meant saboteurs trying to outflank their post. That night, between bombardments, Voigt saw movement below, a small white shape fluttering against the gloom. Through his field glasses, he caught the unmistakable cross of mercy. Regulations forbade firing on medics, but reality often blurred those niceties. Artillery observers above him were calling for defensive fire. In that heartbeat of conflict between obedience and conscience, he hesitated. The men beside him did too. Later testimonies from captured German soldiers confirm a rare moment of silence spreading across the line. One private admitted the sight looked like a ghost walking. The nurse's flag, caught in the wind, seemed absurdly fragile. Germans and Americans alike watched, suspended between disbelief and respect. When one flare burst overhead, they saw her kneeling beside limp bodies, motioning for stretchers. No one pulled a trigger. For 10 miraculous minutes, war paused, not by treaty, but by human recognition of what should never be targeted. Voigt would later write in his diary that he refused to order fire because she bore the only flag worth obeying that night. Every unit depended on leadership strong enough to harness chaos. In medical commands, that leadership often flowed upward from the bottom ranks. Captains and majors issued orders, but nurses like her became the moral fulcrum around which men steadied themselves. In the field hospitals near Hurgen, officers quickly learned to trust the calm decisiveness of their senior nurses more than abstract doctrine. The rescue that night rippled through the chain of command like a whisper of both terror and pride. The commanding surgeon initially called her disappearance desertion into hell. But when word arrived that stretchers were returning under a spontaneous ceasefire, he simply ordered more morphine prepared. Leadership means absorbing consequences. She had taken the burden without consultation. What her superiors later recognized was that such spontaneous defiance sustained morale in a different way than medals or directives. Soldiers who had watched her crawl into the storm now measured their own endurance against hers. In official dispatches, there was no report titled Impossible Rescue. Bureaucracy hides its saints behind acronyms. Still, an informal citation circulated for exemplary initiative in recovery under fire. Leadership, by its quietest definition, is the power to compel others to hope when they no longer believe. The moral battlefield of World War II stretched far beyond strategy maps. Nurses confronted ethical questions as harrowing as any faced by generals. Whose life should be saved first when supplies fail? What risks are justified for mercy? The Geneva Convention offered rules, but no sanction for conscience. Her decision challenged every moral limit drilled into her training. She knew that one life does not outweigh many, yet she also understood that moral calculus collapses under the weight of a human cry. In interviews years after the war, an Army chaplain described such acts as faith converted into motion. Walking into enemy sight to retrieve the wounded demanded not just nerve, but acceptance of death without resentment. For the German officers watching, that gesture pierced their propaganda as sharply as shrapnel. Weeks later, some cited it during surrender interrogations. She reminded us we were men again. That sentence became part of Allied counter-propaganda leaflets, but its power lay in sincerity rather than utility. In a war that industrialized killing, her act rehumanized the battlefield for one haunting interval. It demonstrated that compassion itself could operate as a weapon against despair, altering the logic of violence, if only briefly. As dawn bled across the forest and artillery resumed, the nurse and her team re-entered the hospital compound carrying the last stretcher. The moment of stillness shattered. Yet everyone who had witnessed it, from corpsmen to distant enemy sentries, remembered that silence as more deafening than all the shells that followed. The flare that froze the battlefield was fading when the first shot cut through the wind. Coming back, 2 litters. Out on the slope, 3 figures moved like shadows bent under impossible weight. The nurse's boots sank thigh-deep in snow. Her gloved hands clenched the litter rails until skin peeled beneath the seams. The corpsman stumbled behind, one limping, the other bleeding from a splintered calf. Between them lay a soldier whose stomach wound soaked the canvas darker than the night itself. Minutes earlier, they had reached the drainage trench and found 6 men alive, barely. Hypothermia already dulled their pain. The nurse worked without speaking, as if afraid any word might wake the guns. She pressed morphine into blue lips, checked pulses by instinct, and forced air into stiff lungs. When she raised her flashlight, shielded beneath gauze, the German line flared again, as though blinking in disbelief. A white tracer hissed over her head, then stopped. Whether mercy or confusion spared them, no one would ever know. The first trip back took 40 endless minutes. Halfway up the ridge the litter tipped, tumbling the wounded man into the snow. She dropped with him, shielding his body from the gust of splinters that followed the next explosion. The world drifted in red flashes, and silence between detonations. When she opened her eyes, her helmet was gone, but the patient still breathed. She reached for the litter, teeth chattering uncontrollably, and crawled inch by inch uphill until another pair of hands, an orderly who had run to meet them, grabbed hold. When they crossed the last stretch of open ground, American sentries lifted the gate pole and waved them through. Inside the hospital yard, Floodlights flared against the smoke. Medics ran forward, cursing and laughing in the same breath. The nurse did not stop to rest. She turned back toward the ridge. 5 more, she said, voice hoarse. Her commanding surgeon hesitated only a second before nodding. 2 volunteers followed her again. In the hours that followed, they repeated the journey twice more. Each time the peril grew. German units, recovering from shock, resumed intermittent shellfire. The fragile truce evaporated, yet something restrained their volleys whenever the white flag reappeared. Some German officers later admitted instructing their gunners to fire short, unwilling to be responsible for ending that strange vigil of mercy. Inside the hospital, chaos became organized miracle. Surgeons carved pathways through queues of stretchers. Orderlies cut clothing, applied tourniquets, shouted for ether. The air thickened with a metallic scent of blood warming against stoves. Above it all, she moved like a ghost of efficiency, scissors flashing, bandages wrapping, directing others with calm precision. Those who had doubted her earlier now treated her words as orders. Near midnight, she collapsed beside the final patient, her own coat ripped to ribbons. Another nurse tried to guide her toward the heater, but she refused until roll call confirmed all missing were accounted for. The surgeon finally ordered her confined to a cot, threatening official reprimand if she rose again. She obeyed, barely conscious, still counting bandage rolls in her head. Beyond the walls, the forest roared anew. German artillery shifted aim, pounding American rear areas as the Bulge widened. Yet some among the enemy held their fire slightly high, remembering the sight of that small red cross swaying through smoke. Unintentionally, the Americans in that sector gained a window, mere hours, in which evacuation columns slipped through the ravine unscathed. The nurse's reckless compassion had yielded a tactical reprieve statistics would never record. At dawn, pale light bled across shattered glass. The men rescued during the night still breathed. Word spread through the regiment faster than any order. A nurse had crossed no man's land and brought them home. When the colonel visited the hospital, he found her wrapped in blankets, eyes open but distant. She asked only whether they'd repaired the generators. Amputations required power for lights. He nodded, certain any praise would sound absurd. Outside, snow continued to fall, erasing footprints and trenches alike. Inside, the rhythm of the hospital slowed from frenzy to exhaustion, a heartbeat returning to its normal pace after sprinting beyond endurance. Reports of the event reached higher headquarters within 2 days, recorded blandly in the daily summary. Field medical personnel successfully retrieved wounded under difficult conditions. Commendations pending. There was no mention of the pause in fighting, or the silent respect of the enemy. Official language could not contain the emotion of that night. But among those who lived it, the memory hardened into legend. The night mercy ruled the Hürtgen Forest, and an American nurse defied both fear and physics to carry men back from death's edge. And though the war around them raged on with full, merciless strength, that singular episode marked a turning point, not for the campaign, but for their understanding of what still defined humanity amid annihilation. Dawn arrived shyly, brushing thin amber light over the forest's frozen ruins. The guns still cracked, but their rhythm faltered, like a beast too tired to snarl. Inside the hospital, the night's ordeal had hardened into routine again, the sound of saws, scissors, and soft commands. The nurse, pale under the lantern glow, moved from cot to cot with the reflex of someone whose body had forgotten exhaustion. Word of her rescue spread outward, first through the infantry companies regaining their line, then across the neighboring American divisions. "The nurse who crossed the ridge" became a phrase that needed no embellishment. Soldiers passing through offered her silent salutes. Commanders, startled by the story's reach, ordered an inquiry, partly to verify, partly to protect her from court-martial for disregarding regulations. By noon, the inquiry chairman, a colonel with eyes sunk from sleepless nights, interviewed witnesses. His pen and paper notes distilled heroism down to logistics. Distance covered, time elapsed, casualties retrieved. When he asked her why she had gone, she answered simply, "Because they called." The colonel stared a long moment, then wrote nothing in the final space where "reason for action" belonged. Meanwhile, on the opposite ridge, Oberleutnant Voigt filed his own brief report to battalion headquarters, writing that enemy medical personnel entered the front area under flag of truce. No fire ordered. His superiors reprimanded him for discretion, bordering on insubordination. Yet the report's existence, archived later in Allied files, offered confirmation of what American witnesses swore they saw. The guns had ceased because one soldier in white walked into their sights. That afternoon, as evacuation convoys prepared to move west, the nurse oversaw loading procedures despite her bandaged hands. When a young corpsman tried to replace her, she refused. "If I don't check them myself, someone will be left behind," she said, as if the world were still measured in that particular trench's 6 souls, and not in millions. Rain began to melt the layered snow, releasing the metallic stench of blood into the thawing air. Trucks rumbled through puddles reflecting broken trees. In the distance, the battle thundered toward the Meuse. A new offensive stirred, but those who had survived the night found themselves slower to hate. 2 days later, German long-range artillery found the hospital's coordinates. Shells crashed into the factory yard, shredding the canvas wards they had rebuilt after each bombardment. Amid collapsing beams, she directed the relocation of patients to a drainage tunnel, her voice cutting through chaos again, the same measured tone that had guided them through the rescue. Not once did she duck before others. She moved last. When the barrage ended, silence settled thick with plaster dust. The wounded inside the tunnel broke spontaneously into applause. It wasn't for victory, it was relief. The knowledge that their guardian was still breathing. She simply nodded, brushing soot from her brow, and resumed checking pulses. Later, when front lines advanced past Hurgen, the hospital's remnants withdrew for reconstruction near Lille. There she received notice of citation for gallantry under fire, approved by a general she had never met. She treated the document like an unwanted prescription, folded it twice, and used it as a bookmark in the worn medical manual she carried since 1943. Commendations had no power to change the only verdict that mattered: the number of lives saved versus lost. Among the German prisoners transferred through her care weeks later was Voigt himself, captured near the Remagen bridgehead. When he recognized the same Red Cross armband tied around her sleeve, he could barely speak. In broken English he murmured, "You stopped the shooting." That night, she looked at him silently for several seconds, then replied, "It was all of us who stopped." He nodded once, eyes glistening. Witnesses observed him weeping quietly. That brief encounter encapsulated everything the records could never tell: the mutual surrender to humanity beneath layers of uniform and ideology. By March 1945, the Western Front had transformed, the Allies pushing deep into the Rhineland. News of atrocities filtered through liberated towns, each revelation more chilling than the last. For those who had seen kindness survive in the woods of Hurgen, the contrast carved a deeper ache. They knew what men could be, and what they had chosen, for one night at least, not to be. As headquarters formalized after-action reports and campaigns blurred into broader strategy, the episode dissolved into footnotes. Temporary cessation of fire due to medical evacuation. To bureaucrats, it was an anomaly. To those who carried litter poles through the snow, it remained proof that mercy could hold ground, if only for minutes, against the machinery of annihilation. In April, as Allied columns reached the Rhine, the nurse was reassigned to a rear hospital. Colleagues noticed she still limped slightly. Frostbite had taken 2 toenails, but her hands remained steady. When asked to lecture new recruits on field protocol, she emphasized not procedure but purpose. You treat enemies the same way, because pain doesn't wear a uniform. Her words drifted through generations of military medicine, echoed later in Korea and Vietnam, when medevacs flew under the same emblem she had carried on foot. That winter night had begun as an act of instinct. It ended as a lineage of principle, and from that singular defiance amid the Hurgen snow unfolded a legacy that neither smoke nor bureaucracy could erase. It was over for now, but the war, relentless as ever, left behind hearts altered by the knowledge that compassion could sometimes disarm an army more effectively than firepower. When the guns of the Hürtgen Forest finally fell silent the following spring, historians tallied numbers: 27,000 American casualties, 28,000 German, uncounted civilians. Scrap metal carpeted the soil where evergreens once stood. Yet inside military archives another ledger took shape. Thousands of wounded, who had survived because field medicine had advanced faster than destruction. The nurses' temporary hospital, rebuilt near Liège, became a collection point for those men. They arrived on stretchers scarred by scorch marks and initials carved by comrades. Every survivor carried more than physical wounds. Some trembled at sudden sounds. Others stared at ceiling beams, seeing again the branches that once rained splinters. The staff understood without words. In official reports, the Hürtgen engagement merited little beyond its strategic frustration. But among the medical corps, that battle became shorthand for endurance on the edge of reason. In lessons taught at Walter Reed Hospital after the war, instructors referenced Hürtgen protocols, triage systems improvised in blackout conditions, frenzy reduced to method through discipline. Her notes and diagrams, precise, almost clinical, circulated anonymously within training manuals. Students learned from her handwriting without ever knowing her name. She seemed content with anonymity. War correspondents later sought interviews, but she declined. "The wounded should be the story," she said once to a chaplain, "not the people who get them through." Instead, she dedicated her post-war service to advising new evacuation units on field design, stressing flexibility, mobile huts capable of survival under bombardment, generator redundancy, medical supply camouflage. In debriefings, she argued that humanitarian protection markings, though sacred under law, required reinforcement through radio communication rather than mere symbols. She had seen how close mercy came to being erased by crossfire. Her colleagues noted subtle changes in her temperament. She laughed more easily than before, yet fell silent whenever thunder rolled across summer skies. A German POW camp guard, now interned near Liège, sent a note through the Red Cross thanking the white flag nurse for saving men from both sides. She never replied, but kept the letter folded behind the citation she still used as a bookmark. Back home, newspaper clippings printed partial versions of the event. "Angel of the Ardennes, Florence Nightingale of Hurgen." The headlines embarrassed her. Heroism, she believed, was merely persistence carried through fear. She reminded friends that hundreds of others had done the same on smaller scales every night. Yet even she admitted, years later, that something unexplainable had occurred out there, a suspension of logic where humanity briefly outweighed command. For the soldier she helped rescue, the aftermath took other forms. Private James Levy learned to walk again, though shrapnel remained embedded in his ribs. He married a physiotherapist he met during rehabilitation, and named their first daughter after the nurse he scarcely remembered except for calm blue eyes and smoke. Corporal Miguel Anders re-enlisted in the peacetime Army Medical Corps, convinced that tending wounds was the only proper continuation of combat experience. Medical historians credit the post-Hürtgen years with establishing evacuation standards that lasted for decades. Stretchers became lighter, surgical kits modular, and medevac routes coordinated by radio code rather than improvised runners. Each of those progressions carried echoes of one night's improvisation with a bedsheet and a flagpole. For the nurse herself, the war ended officially in August 1945 when Japan surrendered. She returned stateside aboard a hospital ship that smelled of diesel and antiseptic, tending seasick soldiers during the voyage. Photographs show her on deck, wind whipping the same hair once stiff with frost, eyes half closed, not in triumph, but in release. The world she stepped into was different, yet eerily quiet. No shellfire, no groans, only the steady surf of home. She carried no medals visible, just a plain uniform and a duffel containing medical texts, a stethoscope, and a letter from a grateful enemy officer. For the Army, the Hürtgen nurse became a minor notation among millions of service records. For those who witnessed her act, she remained proof that mercy could alter even the mathematics of war. And far from the devastated forest she'd left behind, another storm brewed in her memory, the one question that would follow her for the rest of her life. What might have happened if she hadn't gone? The post-war months settled like dust over the European theater, turning the living's urgency into the stillness of reconstruction. The ruins of the Hürtgen Forest were slowly cleared by locals and Allied engineers, though the soil continued to yield grenades, helmets, and bones for years. What could never be dug out was the memory carried by those who had seen the flag of mercy rise amid the snow. Rumors about that night persisted inside both armies. American records referenced it obliquely, while in German veteran circles it gained near mythic tone, a passage of collective shame and solace. Letters smuggled through prisoner-of-war mail recount how our machine guns froze as she passed, how the silence felt heavier than any bombardment. Historians studying these archives after the war would marvel that two enemy units described the same pause almost word for word. In 1946, a U.S. Army Medical Symposium in Paris included an anonymous case study of courage under fire in a field hospital. Attendees knew whom it described. Her fellow nurses had submitted the report without naming her. One passage concluded, "For minutes that could have destroyed her, discipline and compassion became indistinguishable." The phrase later appeared on a bronze plaque installed at the Army Medical Department Museum. No names, just that sentence. She stayed in the service briefly after Europe's liberation, tending displaced civilians in bombed German towns. It was in one of those clinics, converted from a schoolhouse, that she first treated former Wehrmacht soldiers as patients rather than prisoners. She cleaned wounds on uniforms still smelling of cordite, and found herself explaining, in halting German, how to prevent infection. Each gesture seemed to finish the conversation that had begun during her crossing through the snow. Civilian life proved harder. When demobilization arrived, she returned to Chicago, entered nursing education, and in lectures sidestepped every attempt to draw parallels between textbook heroism and her own experience. To her students she said, "Rules matter until compassion overrules them." They wrote it on blackboards in looping chalk. She smiled, erasing it only after class to keep the words fresh each morning. Awards followed inevitably: Army honors, a brass-edged citation from the International Red Cross, and, decades later, the Florence Nightingale Medal. Each recognition reopened the silence she had cultivated. "They should decorate the cold," she once muttered to a reporter, "because it did half the work." Her life after the war traced the quieter rhythm of healing. She joined veterans' hospitals during the Korean conflict, mentoring younger nurses in combat trauma. Many of them never learned about Hurgen until a photograph surfaced in an Army newsletter, the familiar white sheet partly visible behind a group of medics posing among pine stumps. By then she was retired, living near a lake in Wisconsin, her gait slowed but posture unbowed. The German officer, Voigt, emigrated to Canada after his release. In 1961 he traveled to Washington, D.C. for a medical ethics conference and left an unsigned bouquet at the Nurses' Monument in Arlington, with a note that read, "Thank you for showing us how to end a battle properly." Years later, archaeologists surveying the Hürtgen Forest unearthed fragments of enamel tags and one stainless surgical clamp stamped U.S. Med. It is believed to have belonged to the same hospital unit. The clamp now rests in a museum display beside a caption free of drama, "Field Surgery Instrument, Winter 1944, used during ceasefire rescue." The austerity of the label fits her legacy. For visitors who pause before it, the object seems ordinary, until they read the footnote describing the rare occasion when both sides simultaneously withheld fire. Then the clamp becomes a relic of something greater than steel or discipline, an instant when compassion replaced command. By the time she passed away peacefully in 1982, a handful of surviving soldiers attended her memorial. One recited a simple line he had memorized from a long-ago triage tent. "You treat enemies the same way." No anthem followed, no volley of rifles, just silence, deep and complete, echoing the one she had created decades before. That silence was her true inheritance to history, proof that even in total war, a human being could still choose gentleness and, for a fleeting night in a frozen forest, make the world obey. In the grand tally of the Second World War, the night of the impossible rescue barely registers. A few quiet entries in medical records, a veteran's rumor, a half-remembered diary notation. Yet its resonance endures because it exposes something the official chronologies rarely manage to measure: the moment when compassion disarms calculation. The Nurses' Act did not alter the front line, redirect armies, or shorten the war by a single day. It did, however, remind everyone who witnessed it, from frozen young privates to disillusioned enemy officers, that mercy could still exist inside the world's worst catastrophe. Against the architecture of modern warfare, mechanized, industrial, impersonal, she wielded nothing more than cloth and conviction. In that juxtaposition lay the purity of its symbolism. Historians often debate whether such gestures matter in the long arc of history. Yet entire moral frameworks are sustained by the evidence that kindness remains possible. The Red Cross insignia she carried was designed to guarantee neutrality. She transformed it, if only for minutes, into the highest assertion of shared humanity. No doctrine, no political speech, no surrender ceremony matched the quiet authority of her crossing through gunfire simply because suffering called and she answered. The Hürtgen Forest eventually regrew. Saplings pushed through rusted helmets. Birds nested where mortars once stood. The land healed, slowly, forgetting the noise that had once defined it. But beneath its soil lie traces of that strange interlude when both sides blinked and the world held its breath. That pause became a seed of memory, germinating far beyond its coordinates into every hospital where a medic chooses empathy over indifference, each scene where duty takes the softer shape of care. Her story endures not as legend but as evidence, proof that war, for all its machinery, still yields to the simplest human impulse to protect life. And though names fade and archives crumble, that moment of silence endures like an indestructible heartbeat beneath the snow, reminding us that even amid the machinery of death, the capacity for grace can still command the field.